come to what I think is the highlight of our conference already. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Prof David Crystal, who is going to give us a talk entitled "You Can Never Have Too Much Phonetics." And over to you straight away.
Thanks, John. Or you can never have too much mobile phone communication. And this is one of those lectures where, as they say in the theatre, would everybody please turn off their mobile phones. But in this particular case, seeing as it's a phonetic conference, please do leave them on. The only problem is that if a mobile phone does go off, then you have to come down here and produce an unrounded back high vowel accurately. So it's up to you entirely. I don't mind. I shall turn my phone off, but there we are. You can never have too much phonetics. The actual quotation goes like this. Phonetics, phonetics, phonetics. You can never have too much phonetics. That is what Anthony Burgess said in his book, A Mouthful of Air, which you may have read. He was a novelist, of course, and a poet and a musician and a composer and a Renaissance man. And so it was not surprising to find that a Renaissance man eventually would take up phonetics. That is what Renaissance men did, as we'll be talking about in a few moments. And most phoneticians, by contra, are also Renaissance men and women, I believe. So it wasn't surprising to think of Anthony Burgess writing a book on this subject. What did surprise me was the enthusiasm with which he took up the subject. He was an enthusiastic phonetician. I met him a couple of times, and he knew my background, and I knew his, and, you know, when you meet a famous novelist, etc., you want to ask him questions about his novels and that. But you didn't get a word in because he was always saying, what about this accent, and what about that intonation pattern, and what's that vowel you just used, and all this sort of thing. And they said, oh yeah, can we talk about literature? No, we want to talk about phonetics. And that was the way of it. And he was into linguistics too, because he did a fantastic book on James Joyce. So, you know, the message I got from Anthony Burgess was that he felt, as somebody who had no background in the subject at all, he was a self-made phonetician, he learnt it by himself, as it were, from the sources he had available to him. Never did a course on phonetics in his life, and yet his exposition is extremely clear and very illuminating and very idiosyncratic in some ways, very vivid in some ways. And the message I learnt from him was that everybody is interested in phonetics. They may not know it, but they are. And the job of the phonetician is to, as it were, point out to people this deep desire they have to learn phonetics. It's innate in everybody, he argued. And I think he is right, actually. I have never met anybody who does not have, deep down inside, an interest in the sounds of their language, or of other languages, or sounds in general. And it is simply a matter of pointing out to them that if they develop some reflective expertise on this instinct, there's a great deal of illumination that can result. Well, you know that. When I say you can never have too much phonetics, of course, I'm not suggesting that phonetics doesn't sometimes get in the way of leading an ordinary life, which it does. I mean, I remember once at a very early phonetics congress, and perhaps one or two of you were at it. John Wells might have been at it, for instance. Klaus Kohler giving a lecture, and he was arguing that it was possible to do a 5-point trill. Right? Now that's very clever. A 5-point trill. What he was, what are the 5 points? You see, well, of course, you can go with bilabial trill, and you can go with a tongue-tip trill, and you can go at the back with a uvular trill. That's 3. And then your vocal cords are trilling, so that's 4. So what was going to be the 5th, you see? So he said an epiglottal trill. And, you know, so I said, there's no such thing. He said, listen. So I had a listen, and sure enough, there was this kind of fluttering noise coming from somewhere deep down, as if he was going to be ill. And then he said, I'm going to do them all together now. Well, I always thought this was a bit of a cheat, because if you do them, well, you can't hear them all at the same time. But anyway, he did this, you see. He started off with the epiglottal trill, then he voiced it, then he put the uvular in, then he did the and then, And it was like nothing on earth. It was like something out of Star Wars. What sound you'd expect an alien to do. And I was just so impressed with this. So I said to myself, I am going to learn to do a 5-point trill. So I leave the lecture room and go down, wherever it was, to the tube station. And I go down and I'm on the platform going... and so on. And then I suddenly realised that nobody is standing near me. And people at both ends of the platform are sort of looking down there. I sort of weakly look around and say, I'm only practising phonetics. But of course people don't believe you, they think you're nuts. Start doing your performance practice in public places. So phonetics can sometimes get in the way, and I don't think Anthony Burgess anticipated that. One of the tasks of the phonetician, I think, is to try and bridge this gap between the knowledge that we have of sounds as phoneticians and the demands and the interests of the general public and about those sounds. If it's one of the professions, I don't think we have a problem. I guess most people here are here because they have a profession which involves the systematic use of phonetics, otherwise you wouldn't be here at all, I suppose. And if one looks at those traditions, one finds plenty to support one's predilection for teaching and learning the subject. So if you're in ELT, then there is a whole raft of stuff that you would refer to in order to put your interest into practice. Piles of stuff about how to teach vowels and consonants and even intonation patterns, though perhaps not so much there, and things like that. If you're a speech therapist, the same. I mean, plenty of books which will tell you how to therap in an efficient way using phonetic notions, criteria, practical tools, and so on. So the professions are pretty well served, at least the well-recognised professions, the traditional professions like language teaching and speech therapy, and so on. What is of interest is when you come up against professions that have not been well served by the subject, or areas that simply have been ignored by the subject. And I mention this now because I don't want to draw too false a distinction between pure phonetics, as it were, and applied phonetics. When I say that there's a great deal of work to be done on the applied side, I'm not suggesting that we have a complete subject called phonetics, which it is simply the business of the applied phonetician to apply to particular circumstances which haven't been well treated in the past. No, there are problems on the phonetic side as well. I mean, phonetics is an ever-evolving subject. There are always areas of exploration that one says to oneself, oh, you know, one needs to develop those areas. And even sometimes completely brand new areas that have received, as far as I can see, next to no, maybe no treatment at all. And I just mentioned one to illustrate the way in which phonetics as a subject still has an evolutionary path to travel. And it comes out of, as all phonetics does really, observation of everyday practice. And the example I give you of where general phonetics has still some movement in it, as it were, is this. I was a little while back listening to a conversation. I don't participate in conversations, phoneticians generally don't. They listen to them. So I was there in this conversation and listening to what was going on. And somebody said this. He said, John will be with us in a minute. Uh-oh, it's going to be trouble. And I thought to myself, that's funny, that. How would I transcribe that? You see, what we've got here, of course, is the theme from Jaws, yes? Which everybody knows, and if you don't know it, then you've got a joy to watch one day. But if you don't know the film, you've probably heard the in a conversation somewhere or other. And I thought, you know, how do you transcribe that? You know, I mean, you might be able to characterize it in terms of a consonant and a vowel sequence, but the point is that is not what it's about. That is a piece of music that has been introduced into speech. and it has a certain pitch range and a certain point in the voice, it would not make sense to, here's John coming in, dun, dun, dun. You can't do it up there. It's got to be, it's got to be low down in the voice. So there is a kind of absolute quality for that particular sequence, which we're not used to in phonetics. I mean, phonetics is a relative subject. I mean, we cannot speak out of tune. You know, the concept of absolute values is not something we would incorporate into our transcription. You would not write an intonation sequence, although I know it was tried once upon a time, with a stave and a key signature, and up and down and up and down and up and down. But here is something where you do seem to need to incorporate some kind of absolute musical element in order to capture it. And I'm not quite sure how one would do that in phonetics. And that's one example. So I thought, you know, as always in phonetics, when you find one example, you find dozens, don't you? Or you start listening out for them. So I started listening out for them, and within a few days, I heard another one. I've just been sort of jotting them down for this evening to get some examples. This one surprised me because it related to another film, or a television series this time, which has not been on air for many decades. Somebody, again, it was a threatening situation. Somebody was talking about something dangerous possibly happening, and they went, dan, 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 which is the theme from Dragnet, which as far as I know has not been on television for decades. And so this is a kind of archaism, an intonational archaism, which was being used by some young people who could never possibly have seen the original film, and yet they were aware of the tune from it. So that's another piece of music. How would you transcribe that? And then somebody brought in on another occasion into a room full of people having dinner, and she had prepared the special pudding, and she brings the pudding in through the door and goes, ta-da! Like most of you have done, I suspect, once upon a time or another. How does one deal with ta-da? Again, the vowel and consonant element of it is not difficult, but what do you do with, to say it's two level tones or something like that doesn't capture it at all. I mean, the musical element that is part there is simply not something that we're used to transcribing. I heard somebody else do, I'm thinking back now over, I've been collecting these examples for the past, year really. And at another point, another introductory kind of musical pattern was a race call, a race track call. Somebody came in with something, said, it was out of tune, like my example was, but it was recognisably that kind of fanfare that you often get at the beginning of a racetrack. How many people would recognise it, I don't know, but certainly everybody in the room did at that particular point. Then there was, some humorous ones, jocular ones. Laurel and Hardy's tune I've heard used in conversation. I've heard that one used. I've heard in slightly more incestuous kind of relationship. I mean, people who share a particular interest in, they're aficionados of a particular thing. For instance, I've got three examples here. I've got people who were so mad on the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind that whenever anything at all mystical or unreal was going to happen in the conversation, they would go da 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 da, and everybody would immediately also go da 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 in one of those rapport building pieces of phonetics that enliven so many conversations. I've heard the theme from Doctor Who, especially recently, come into conversation. Anybody wanting to just feel cool about anything would simply go da-da-da-dan, 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 dan-dan, and that was immediately recognised by everybody. And a joint chant, in one case, then came into being with 3 or 4 people simultaneously in this conversation, please note, introducing this mock piece of music. Unison speech is also something that is not easily transcribable in a traditional phonetic context. And the third example I heard was of some aficionados of the Prisoner, the cult television series from the 1960s, which is still going on, and there are all kinds of riffs in that which I won't bother producing now because you wouldn't recognise them unless you really are into the prisoner in a big way. Music in speech. How does one handle it? I mean, it's not that the point has never been noticed, because people have often talked about intonational idioms of the sort, Johnny, you know, where are you, that sort of thing, which have a fixed intonational range and quite absolute in character in many ways. So people have noticed that sort of thing. But it's surprising how much music comes into speech. And the reason why I mention the examples, and you can probably think of many more from your own backgrounds, is that I just don't know what to do with them. You know, if I was carrying out a phonetic transcription of a conversation where those things were in, I do not know how to transcribe them. End of story. Therefore, there is something here which, in the field of general phonetics, needs a bit of work. And so there must be other areas like this. So, to go back to my point, I'm not suggesting for a moment that when I say that there's a lot of things to be done in applied phonetics, that everything has been done in pure phonetics. I mean, you know, there are things to be done on both sides. But applied phonetics is the area where the more exciting, the more unpredictable, the more innovative procedures are awaiting exploration. And so for the bulk of my talk, I wanted to illustrate my recent experience in encountering one of these previously untouched domains. It's one of those professions which, in theory, gets some phonetic training, in practice does not get as much as it should. And in some cases doesn't get any at all, or hardly any. It is the field of professional acting. If you go to an acting course, and I have first-hand experience of this, not because I ever went on an acting course, but my son did. He is an actor, and so when he was doing his training, I was able to, as it were, follow the things he was doing and see where he was getting things and where he wasn't getting things and all the rest of it. And he, knowing the business, was able to tell me about other courses that were working in acting, and to go to the present point, how much phonetics they were getting. And the range was from some quite sophisticated phonetics in some places to none at all in others, or next to none, hardly anything at all. And therefore you get a lot of actors coming through who end up with a very sketchy awareness, for instance, of English accents and English dialects, but English accents in particular, and the only way they seem able to cope with the demands placed upon a character to have a particular accent is by, as they say, sitting with Nelly, you know, listening to somebody who uses the accent and copying what they do. So Ben has many friends, or my son Ben has many friends, who, if they're given a role, say, which has a Newcastle accent, they travel up to Newcastle, or try and find a tame Geordie in London in order to get examples of the accent. They sit and listen and try and copy and try and get it right. Now that is crazy. That you should have to travel hundreds of miles just because you want to hear an accent. And in the case that I'm now going to talk about, it is impossible to get a model for the accent, because I'm going to talk about the accent of Shakespeare. And it is not possible to travel several hundred miles and hear a Shakespearean accent, because he's dead, and has been for quite a while. So we have a problem here. Now the problem manifested itself quite dramatically about 18 months ago in my case, when I was approached by Shakespeare's Globe in London to work with them on a project. Now I don't know whether you know Shakespeare's Globe. Some of you, it's on the South Bank by Southwark Bridge next to the Tate Modern. It's a replica, as far as anybody can make it work, of the Globe Theatre as it would have been in Shakespeare's time. And it opened in 1997, and it is producing plays there every year for 6 months of the year between May and beginning of October. And the rest of the year it opens as a kind of museum, really, and people go and look around it, and they do educational programs and things like that. Now the Globe is committed to an original practices philosophy, by which one means that they want to put on productions which, as far as possible, are authentic, insofar as anybody knows. And so, for instance, they go in for original costumes as much as possible. They do the occasional thing in modern dress, but for the most part they go in for original costumes. They go in for original musical practices on older style instruments, again, whenever possible. They go in for original movement routines, whenever they can. They go in for original everything. But they had never gone in for original pronunciation, or OP for short. Original pronunciation. The pronunciation that would have been heard on the globe stage around the year 1600. Right? Not Shakespeare's pronunciation. We're not talking about his individual pronunciation, but the pronunciation that would have been typical on the stage here in the globe 400 years ago. It's not true to say that people hadn't speculated about it, and indeed several books have been written on it. But at the theatrical level, there had, to my knowledge, been only one experiment done in Britain, at any rate. There may have been experiments done in Canada and the States and elsewhere, I do not know. But in Britain, there had only been one experiment, and that was performed in 1952 by the theatre director John Barton when he was studying at Cambridge. And it was done by an amateur group, and they did an amateur production of Julius Caesar in an attempted reconstruction of original pronunciation. But apart from that, it hadn't been tried. And certainly on the London stage, it hadn't been tried, and certainly by a professional group, it hadn't been tried, and certainly not for a whole run of a play, it hadn't been tried in 400 years. So the Globe decided to do it. They were very scared about doing it, let me say. The reason why they hadn't done it was because they felt that original pronunciation would be unintelligible. That speech must have changed so much in the last 400 years that a modern audience simply would not be able to understand it. I mean, it's difficult enough understanding Shakespeare sometimes anyway. So to add a dimension of original pronunciation, they felt, was just going to be too far. And the prospect of having an audience come in, start listening to a play, and then walking out because they cannot understand it was so scary that although the idea had first come up 2 or 3 years ago, they decided that they just didn't want to go down that path. And then a director there, Tim Carroll by name, started to press them on the point and said that it really was something that the Globe ought to do, because after all, if you do listen to a Shakespeare play, you very often hear rhymes that do not work because the modern pronunciation is different from the older one, or you hear puns that do not work because, again, the language has changed. And so he was saying, wouldn't it be a good idea to have a go at this? So what would it sound like? So they looked round for a tame phonetician to try and do something. They approached me because I have had a lot to do with the Globe over the last 10 years. I've often written articles for their magazine. I've given a few lectures there on aspects of Shakespeare, sometimes with Ben. I was the Sam Wanamaker, he was the founder of the Globe, fellow there for a year, a couple of years back. And so they know me quite well, and I knew them very well, and so they naturally approached me, and I thought, but as you do, you know, as all academics do when they're asked to do something, you look for other academics who have done it first, so that it will make your life easier. And you look around you, and there was nothing, you see. Nobody had ever tried to do this before. There had been a few transcriptions of early modern English, as we must call it, in various textbooks. And those of you who know Gimson's Introduction to the Pronunciation of English, there is a small fragment of Shakespeare in there, written in an early modern English style, and so on. And other books had done the same. But nobody had attempted to write a whole play in that sort of way, and certainly nobody had attempted to write a whole play in a way which would enable actors and a director to learn it in order to produce it on stage. Now, before I go any further, I must illustrate it, because the argument that it is unintelligible to modern ears is something that needs to be very firmly nailed at the outset. And the handout that I've given you is an extract from the play that they're doing this year in original pronunciation. I'll explain the background to it in a moment. It's from Troilus and Cressida. And this is from the prologue of Troilus and Cressida, and on the left-hand side you'll see the text in usual transcription, and on the right-hand side is the text in the transcription that I've used, and I'll explain all about it in a moment. You'll see it's a sort of mixture of phonetic script and traditional orthography, for reasons I'll explain in a moment. But just to make sure that we're thinking about the same sort of thing, you be the judge as to whether this is intelligible or not. Some of the words are, of course, difficult. If you don't know what orgulus means, then you don't know it, and you have to look it up. So whether that's in modern pronunciation or original pronunciation doesn't matter. It's a difficult word. So I'm not saying you must understand everything in this, but just generally, do you follow the accent? So I'll read the right-hand side and see how we get on. In Trill there lies the same. From isles of grace, the princes Orgulus, their high blood chafed, have to the port of Athens sent their ships, fraught with the ministers and instruments of cruel war. 69 that wore their crownets regal, from the Tanian bay, put forth toward Phrygia, and their vow is made to ransack Troy, within whose strong immures the ravished Helen, Menelaus queen, with wanton Paris slaves. And that's the carol. Priam six-gated city, Dardan and Timbria, Helios, Catus, Tryon, and Antinorides, with massive staples and corresponsive and fulfilling bolts, spar up the sons of Troy. Now expectation, tickling skittish spirits, on own and other side, Trojan and Greek, sets all on hazard. And hither am I come, a prologue armed, but not in confidence of author's pen or actor's voice, but suited in like conditions as our arguments, to tell you, fair beholders, that our play lates o'er the vaunt and farstlings of those broils, beginning in the middle, starting thence away, to what may be digested in a play. Like or fine thought, do as your pleasures are, no good or bad, 'tis but the chance of war. And that's a nice example of a rhyme which doesn't normally work in modern English, are and war, now becoming pretty approximately the same because of in the older version. Now, I mean, how unintelligible is that? You know, not very, not very. It's an accent that is as different from RP as perhaps is modern Scots or Irish or many a regional accent. If I were to ask you what accent is that most like, you will read into it whatever accent background you have yourself. I went round last year in the interval of a different play asking the people there what they felt it was like. People from England on the whole felt it sounded West Country, Gloucestershire, Warwickshire, something like that. The effect was dominant there. People from Ireland, however, were more likely to notice the O vowels and things like that, and they said, oh, it sounds a bit Irish, you know, and like, words like that, it sounds Irish. People from Wales also felt that it sounded a bit Welsh. There were some Americans there and they said they speak like that in Virginia. And so on. You know, everybody hears in it what they want to hear, and the reason is because this is an accent that was around in 1600. Something similar to this would have gone across the pond to the United States and later down to Australia and so on and so forth, and was not in a sense the origin of the modern accents, but certainly is a period behind which many modern accents could perhaps eventually trace some of their origins. And so people hear what they want to hear in it. The one thing that is true, though, is that it is an accent that you've never heard before. That combination of values that is in here is not like any other accent. And this, of course, is a big problem for actors, because when actors do learn a new accent, they very much want to ground their intuition in the reality that that accent gives rise to. All the baggage that comes with an accent. You know, as you know, anybody who's done any sociolinguistic work on accents, accents do not exist without all kinds of attitudes and values, so that, you know, certain accents sound warm and friendly and other accents sound harsh and whatever. You know, we have these feelings and you can relate to them. But this one doesn't relate to anything particularly. So it is a problem for them to ground themselves in this accent. In the first year that the Globe decided to do this experiment, that was last year, last June, and they decided to dip their toe into the linguistic water just for a weekend, because they were scared that people would not understand it. So there was a production of Romeo and Juliet going on last year in modern English, and they decided to do a weekend of 3 performances of Romeo and Juliet in original pronunciation, which is what they did. And that was the production I was referring to when I said that I went around the audience and asked people what they felt. It was a tremendous success. People found it such an enjoyable experience that the Globe decided to do another version, another play this year, and that's the one we're working on at the moment. And this is from the beginning, as you probably recognise, from Troilus and Cressida. And it's a production that hasn't started yet, so if you were in London and you wanted to pick it up, you could do so at the Globe. It's from August the 24th to the end of September, every Wednesday, once a week. It's a curious run, a performance each Wednesday for 6 weeks. What's interesting about the accent? Well, there are various things about it which you probably instinctively recognise. I'll point out some of them in a moment. But the question, of course, that comes into everybody's mind when you do a version of that kind is, of course, how do you know? How do you know? And you know because there are 3 sources of evidence which any historical phonetician would rely upon in order to decide how these values should be. The first I've already mentioned, and that is you analyse the puns and the rhymes and the metrical patterns of Shakespeare himself, and of course all the other authors of the period, in order to work out how it must have been. If the guy is rhyming R and war, then either they were both pronounced something like R and war, or and war. I mean, it's one or the other, probably, or something in between. And so what you do is you analyse lots and lots of cases like that, and in theory, all of them, that is, every possible combination of rhymes that turns up anywhere in early modern English. And this is what scholars have done, of course, over the years. There are some excellent books, 2 or 3 huge books that any of you that's done historical English linguistics will have had to study, books like Helga Kerkeritz's Shakespearean pronunciation, books like that. And these guys have listed in minute detail all the rhymes that are there, and so it makes the job of somebody like me so much easier to be able to go to that and say, well, on balance, we think it must have been R and war rather than or and war. And that's what you do. So that's the first kind of evidence then. You look at the rhymes and the puns. To take an example from Romeo last year, Romeo's first love is not Juliet. Romeo's first love is a lass whose name is written like this. Now the question is, how do you pronounce that? In modern English, of course, it could be Rosalind or it could be Rosaline. When you look at the rhymes in Romeo and Juliet, it has to be line, leun. Because at one point, for example, the friar says, has a little rhyming couplet. The first line ends pupil mine, and then Rosaline. So Rosaline and mine go together. So it's either mine and line, or it's min and lin. But of course, there's no evidence that the word mine was ever pronounced min in any of the texts. So that suggests the second pronunciation, Rosaline, pupil mine. And there are lots of examples like that. So that's the first source of evidence. The second source of evidence is the spellings that are evident in the texts that were printed at the time. In Shakespeare, we have several quarto texts of the plays, and we also have the big first folio of the plays. Now, when you look at the spellings, this is a period, remember, where spelling had not yet become standardised in the history of English. Spelling did not really become standardised until the 18th century, at the time of Dr. Johnson, when the spelling rules finally got laid down. But in the 16th century, people, although there had been some movement towards standardisation, there was still an enormous amount of variation. People were still spelling a lot of words as they would have been pronounced. So, in the there's a speech in Romeo and Juliet by the character called Mercutio about Queen Mab, who is a fairy that comes into your brain and makes you dream. And at one point he describes the properties of this fairy as she travels about, and she has a whip with which she drives her chariot. And the lash is made of, in modern English, of film. And that's how it would be said in an RP production. In the folio and the quarto, it is spelt like this: the whip of film. It has to be film. I mean, why spell it like that if it didn't have some value? It's not an unreal pronunciation. It's actually found in many modern English accents too. You'll hear it in Irish. Are you going to the film? No. Are you going to the film? The film. Yeah. So it's a perfectly plausible version, and there are several spellings which suggest that this is a two-syllable word rather than a one-syllable word. So that's the second source of evidence, the actual spellings that we use. And the third source of evidence is, of course, the fact that at the time, in the 16th century, there were a number of people who wrote quite extensive texts describing how English sounds were pronounced. The phoneticians of the day. We generally call them orthoepists, because their interest was in the pronunciation of letters. Orthoepists, that's right. So you will get quite extensive texts which go through the letters of the English alphabet and say, how is this pronounced? How is this pronounced? How is this pronounced? Are there any variations in the pronunciation? So to go back to the example of the pronunciation of R after vowels, post-vocalic R, as you heard several times, Orgulus, their high blood chafed, port of Athens, sent their ships, and so on. If you ask, how do we know? Because they tell us so. So Ben Jonson, for instance, the dramatist, wrote a grammar. And grammars in those days were rather more wide-ranging than grammars now. And at the beginning, there would always be an account of the sound system of the language and the spellings that were there. And he says, in his account of the letter R in his grammar, we pronounce this sound. He actually says, we say this sound after a vowel. He says that it's not quite the same value at the end of a word as it is at the beginning. We say it less firm, he says. So that suggests that there were two values of R at that time. And maybe the one at the end was weakening. It eventually disappeared, of course, in RP, as you know. But he says, we pronounce it. And in order to make the point clear to his readership, he actually gives it a description. He says, I call it the doggy sound. Doggy, D-O-G-G-Y, the doggy sound. Think grr. And, it's that little help which makes you think, yeah, of course, that's the way the sound was used. And so that's the third source of evidence. Put all those three sources together, the actual text themselves, the spellings, and the descriptions that are available, and you get a transcription, which in my judgment, I would say was about 80% or so pretty damn right. The remaining 20%, we could argue about it, and I guess one day an awful lot of scholars will. Because at the moment, I have no other transcription to compare it with. I don't know anybody else who's been doing this sort of thing. And it would be good that somebody else did, so that somebody else might make different judgments about some of these values, and we could have a nice long argument in the way that phoneticians do about which is right and which is wrong. And one picks up the bloodied corpses from the floor afterwards. That's by way of background. Of course, relating that to the theme of the conference is what I want to say in the remaining part of the talk, and then we'll have perhaps a chance for some questions. And the question is, how on earth do you get that accent across to actors, some of whom have had no training in phonetics at all? So I had to make a decision right at the outset about what kind of transcription to use. Now, you will notice that this transcription is neither chalk nor cheese. It's somewhere in the middle. My original transcription was to write the entire thing out in phonetics, every sound out in phonetics. It was horrendous. I mean, it could have been read, of course, by a phonetician, but these are actors. Yeah? Some of them have never done phonetics before. So you can't teach them the entirety of a phonetics course in the 3 or 4 weeks that they have to learn the play. Remember, the typical rehearsal time for a play is 6 weeks. Yes? Last year it was 4 weeks. Troilus, that's going on in 3 weeks' time, they've been rehearsing for 3 weeks already. So they've got to learn everything. They've got to learn their lines, they've got to learn their movements, they've got to learn the fights, they've got to learn everything. And the accent, I mean, it's inconceivable that they could learn a full phonetic transcription. So I thought, well, the thing to do is to write in phonetics only those sounds which are different from modern English. And that's what you see here, you see. Any word which is spelt in the same way as in modern English, I am saying, was not pronounced differently in Shakespeare's time. So to take the first line, in is the same now as it was then. The is the same now as it was then. In the next line, princes is the same now as it was then. And you start looking at ships in the next line and send, you'll notice that the short vowels are pretty well the same. There's hardly any change in the short vowels between then and now. The long vowels and the diphthongs, however, lots of change. So let's go through some of them. One of the most interesting things is the way in which the 3 diphthongs I, oi, and ow, however you transcribe them in your system you prefer, these two, they're all coming out as a, and o, like that. Notice that these two have come together. Line and loin are both loin, both the same. An interesting source of puns here, therefore. In the introduction to Romeo, in the prologue to Romeo, there's a line which goes, "From forth the fatal loins of these 2 foes." Loins, yeah? But in OP, "From forth the fatal loins of these 2 foes." Loins, is the same now as lines. And therefore, the concept of genealogy is a pun. You know, lines and loins have come together. That would be missed completely in a modern pronunciation. But this is one of the distinctive features of the accent as a whole. These I, you hear it all the time, especially in Troilus and Cressida, because it's Troilus and Troy. In Troy, there lies the scene, from Isles of Grace, the high blood chase, and so on. It's a very frequent sound. It's one of the dominant resonances of this particular accent. Notice the long vowels, which are these days often diphthongized, are often not. There are several examples here. The A diphthong in particular, 6 halfway down primes, 6 gated, 6 gated, 6 gated, 6 gated. It's a pure vowel and it's long. There are several examples of that. Massing, therefore, not staple. Other distinctive features of the accent, from Isles of Grace, the Prince's Orgulus, they're blood, blood, the vowel. That's much later. I mean, nobody quite knows exactly where this vowel was pronounced in Shakespeare's time. Different scholars have suggested it's something like an to something like an going further back. It's somewhere back there, and people vary a bit in their interpretation. But that's what that symbol, this one, is in words like blood. What else could I draw your attention? You might like to ask something afterwards, but that's the basis of the transcription. I'm only transcribing those particular values which are different from modern English. Some of the words, of course, are very different. Author becoming author, for instance. Very common one, about 15 lines down. On one and other side, on own and other side. Own and other, one another. Own and other. There are many other examples there. Now, so this half and half transcription is the interesting thing. This is the novelty of it. This is the bit where it gets a bit scary, because phoneticians, on the whole, don't like half and half transcriptions. You know, on the whole, you know, it's all or nothing, all or nothing. And this was what I meant in the abstract when I said you have to compromise. You have to compromise. When you're doing any kind of applied discipline in linguistics, as I guess in other subjects, you have to compromise. It's a world of half-truths, isn't it? That's what you're doing all the time in applied linguistics, telling a half-truth. You're saying, you know, this is what you need to know in order to get something done. It's not the whole story. If I give you the whole story, you'll be flooded. You won't be able to handle it. So I'm just telling you a little bit for now. Later, maybe you'll get the rest of the story. But this is enough for now. And that's what this thing is. Interested to hear what you think about it, because I did a transcription last year and another one this year, as you see. The two transcriptions are not exactly the same. I wrote up last year's experience in a little book called Pronouncing Shakespeare, which is, here you see the cast last year in their glorious costumes. And the transcription that is in here is not identical with this year's. You know, each one moves on. Well, the pressures upon you are different. I'll give you an example. You see, in 1600, the pronunciation of words like this, musician, was beginning to change. The older pronunciation was to say musician. Musician. That's the older way. That pronunciation was normal in the 16th century. We know this because the orthoepists tell us it was. They say this is how we say it. Today, of course, it's musician. And in between, there was an intermediate period where it became musician. So you hear the sequence, musician, musician, musician. Right? And that musician was in place about 100 years or so later. And again, we know this because there were arguments by these guys in the beginning of the 17th century as to how this word and others like it should be pronounced, with some people saying it's like this and some people saying it's like that. Well, to a modern phonetician, you know what's going on. The two pronunciations are both current in the community, one probably by older people, the other by younger people. We also know that people were well aware that there were accent differences between old and young. Because in Romeo, for instance, Mercutio accuses Tybalt as being, he's one of these new-fangled guys. He has a new sort of sword, he has a new sort of dress, he's a fashionable guy, and he says he's one of the new tuners of accent, says Mercutio about Tybalt. He's a new tuner of accent. So people were well aware that accent changes were going on. Therefore, in the Romeo transcription I did last year, I gave the older pronunciation to the older people in the play, the older Capulets, the senior people, the people who would have been, you know, the fathers and the mothers and the grandfathers and so on. And I gave this pronunciation to the younger ones. So old Capulet would say, call in the musicians, and people like Tybalt would say, where are the musicians? Right? So, not that the audience might have noticed it at all, but it made you feel that you were doing something which reflected the reality of the situation as it must have been. Now this year, there is no corresponding difference between old and young generation really in Troilus. There was no motivation for this kind of distinction, and that's what I meant when I said the pressures on the transcription can vary depending upon the types of character that might be in the play. So there are some variations between last year's and this. One other thing, and that is that it was a decision by the director, and I think it was right, to try and not make the accent homogeneous. By which I mean the version that I have just given you, which I then recorded for all the actors to use as a kind of vade mecum, the risk was that they would all go on stage and they'd all sound like David Crystal, which would have been an absolute disaster, dramatically, let alone anything else. So it was important that the actors owned this accent. They should take it into themselves. And the group of actors last year, as the group of actors this year, came from all parts of the country. So there's a Scottish actor, and an Irish actor, and a Cockney actor, and so on and so forth. So the question was, what should we do with those accents? Should they leave them be and simply assimilate the early modern English system into their accent, or should they all try and get rid of their regional accent and produce a kind of early modern English equivalent of RP? And of course, as you can guess from my tone, we decided on the former course of action. There was no standard English in those days. RP as an accent didn't develop to 200 years later. So what we've got is a range of accents. On the Globe stage in 1600, we know where the actors came from. We know that one of the actors came from Norfolk. We know another actor came from Warwick. We know another actor came from Bristol. We know where they came from. So they would have brought those accents with them. There'd have been some accommodation to the London accent, of course, so we don't exactly know how it would have been, but there would certainly have been some Cockney in there and various other things as well. So there would have been a mix of accents on the stage, and therefore we replicated that. And so what you actually heard on the Globe stage last year was a kind of Scots-tinged early modern English, and Irish-tinged early modern English, and things like that. They all shared the same system, but they gave it their individual slants, as it were. And the actors themselves, I found, were able to, well, last year was not as successful as this year's is, I have to say, because last year they were doing the modern English version of Romeo and Juliet for 3 months, and then they had this 1 month in the middle where they had to learn the OP version. So they had to keep 2 versions of the play in their head at the same time. It was an impossible task for them, really. They did work very well indeed, but I have to say, listening to the final version, that there was a great deal of inconsistency in it, because you know, no human being can really do that without lots and lots of training, and they didn't have that much time. This year it's different. This year the whole run of Troilus is in original pronunciation. And as a result, they have learnt the accent from the very first moment they learnt their first line. And listening to them yesterday, I was down at the Globe, apart from an hour where there was a security alert, we all had to leave the building. They are really very, very consistent this year, and much more so than last year's company was. And I'm expecting to hear a version of the play then that is as accurate as is humanly possible. How do you judge success in something like this? Very difficult. How do you judge success? There are criteria you can use, like the amount of applause that comes at the end of the play. I am an academic, I analyse that. The Globe videos every performance that it does. Not every, I mean, they choose one exemplar of a performance, and it's always videoed. So you can actually, those of you who are interested, can actually go to the Globe and watch the video of last year's performance if you want. Make an arrangement with the librarian. And the applause at the end of the modern English pronunciation went on for, I forget what it was, you know, 1 minute, 3/4 or something like that. And the applause at the end of the original pronunciation version went on for 2.5 minutes. So there's hard scientific evidence here that the OP was successful. It's impossible, really, to make a judgment about how successful something is. People vote in theatres with their bums on seats, and all 3 performances were sellouts. Whether the same effect will be this year, I do not know. Certainly, as far as the actors themselves were concerned, they found the experience, as I've said, I interviewed them all for the book, and many of them simply report that it was one of the most exciting experiences of their acting lives. And the reason they say this is because it enabled them, they are all fed up to the teeth with doing acting in RP, you see. My dear, oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention. You know, they hate that. I mean, they've all had to do it, and so much Shakespeare is done in that way. You know, Laurence Olivier, Gielgud sort of style. And there is a sort of feeling of kind of need to be more down to earth, to be more realistic to the accents that are around you, and especially at the Globe. So the actors themselves felt very excited about this. And the audience did too, because I went around during those intervals, and I'll end with just one story that comes from those interviews with the paying public. I spotted a group of kids, teenagers, at one end of the Globe stage. You appreciate that the Globe is a thrust stage with people standing around it, as well as people sitting at the back. So the groundlings, as they call them, are actually leaning on the stage, like this, in various places. And I spotted this group of kids. So I went over to them and I said, you know, enjoying the play? Oh, They were all inner city London kids. Oh, yeah, it's great, cool, wiki. So I said, do you know what's going on here? She said, yeah, it's an original pronunciation, isn't it? How do you know that? Because our teacher told us. You see, the teacher had briefed them in advance. So that's great. So what do you think about it? She said, great. Why is it great? Well, said this kid, well, because they speak like us. Because they speak like us. Well, of course they weren't. That is nothing like Cockney. But I knew what he meant, you see. What he meant was, because I pressed him on the point, because normally actors talk posh, don't they? And another kid switched down and said, not here, he said, not here. RP 0, OP 1. I was really pleased to hear that these kids felt that there was a warmth, an accessibility, a coming of the accent towards them, which they had picked up. And that, I've got several stories like that, but that's the one that sticks in my mind most. So to sum up, yes, you can never have too much phonetics, but when you are actually trying to give people the phonetics that they want, you do have to make compromises all the time. The compromise in this particular case was a compromise on transcription, which is a pretty serious compromise, by any standards in traditional phonetics. This kind of thing is risky business. And the test is, will people be able to learn it, assimilate it, work with it? And the evidence is that they were able to do so, and the evidence, in a real sense, is that they decided to do it again this year. And I believe they're going to keep on with the experiment in future years. After all, there are only 2 plays done. That means there's 37 to go. Thank you very much. Thank you. Time for some questions on that.
Yes, are there any questions for David? Remember, he needs a drink fairly soon.
But so does the audience.
But yes, be happy to discuss anything. Yeah, please.
Interested in the actors' reactions, like, as you mentioned, some actors have training in phonetics and others don't. Was there a variety of different backgrounds where some who had phonetic training? How did they respond?
Yes, there was indeed, last year and this year too. And indeed, just yesterday, as I left, one of the actors came up and said, thank you for teaching me some phonetics. First time he'd ever had any at all. If there's a distinction to be made, it is that the younger actors on the whole had no trouble getting into it. Some of the older actors had real trouble getting into it, as you might imagine. The most interesting set of observations were some actors, and they all said this at some point or another, it made them change their perception of their part. So the lady, Juliet last year, in modern pronunciation, she said to me, in original pronunciation, I felt I could stand up to the nurse more. I felt tougher in original pronunciation. The actor who played Mercutio, now in that Queen Mab speech I was telling you about earlier, it's all about this little fairy that goes and it's dandelions and daisies and butterflies and all sorts of things about the country. Now the actor said that he'd been doing that in RP all season, and it just didn't feel right. If it's about the country, then my dear, the country's over there. Very different. So he said when he got into the OP, he felt, for the first time, he said that speech, he felt grounded in that speech. That Queen Mab was driving through the countryside, and suddenly he felt it coming from in there. And this is how he said it. He felt it coming from in here. And what he meant was that those vowels, you see, further back, somehow he transferred it into his gut. And they all said this in their own different ways, that it changed their perception of the part. This year, we don't get that reaction because I think the Romeo experiment was unique in that there was a parallel play going on, so they had 2 perceptions of their part. This year the guys are in it from the outset, so I don't expect we'll get that comment.
Jill?
I noticed that you transcribe the Greek forms as
Yes.
Greek forms.
Yes.
Could you like to explain why you did that?
Very important. We know that weak forms are critical to the identity of the period, as is evidenced by the ubiquitous use of the apostrophe in all the texts. Phrases like that, you know, if, in the, where these apostrophes are all over the place. So we know there was an amazing amount of elision taking place at the time. The other thing we know is that from the comments of an awful lot of people who were writing at the time, plus Shakespeare himself, we know that the speech was fast on the stage and very colloquial. You remember the Hamlet speech, where the players come to the court of Elsinore and Hamlet meets the players and he advises them about how he wants them to speak. And he says, speak, he's written a speech for them, and he says, speak the speech, I pray you, as I pronounced it to you, trippingly upon the tongue. But if you mouth it, he says, as I would rather the town crier spoke my lines. So he's saying, speak trippingly, not mouthingly, which suggests that at the time there were two styles of stage oration. And the trippingly one is obviously the one he preferred. So how do you speak trippingly? Well, of course, you put in Greek vowels all over the place as best you can. And so I did. It is a much more colloquial style of, you don't get it so much in the prologue, which is a monologue of some ponderousness. But if I give you an example from Romeo last year, where at one point Romeo looks up at Juliet, having suddenly seen her on the balcony, and in modern English says, "It is my lady, oh, it is my love, oh, that she knew she were, it is my lady, oh, it is my love." Now in OP, with the weak forms and everything coming in, it sounds something like this. Oh, oh, it is me lady, oh, it is me love, me lady, me love, me lady, me love. And that kind of thing, where you get the shorter, I mean, that shortens that line by a significant bit of a second. And another piece of research I did at the end was, it wasn't really research because the Globe staff were quite shocked by it. The play lasted, I forget what, in modern English, 2 hours and 40 minutes, shall we say, whatever it was. In OP, it was 10 minutes shorter every night. And the reason why it was shorter was because of the speed with which all these weak syllables combine to produce the effects like that one there. Multiply that example by, 1,000 in the play, and you get a tremendous shortening. So it was simply an attempt, little punctuation in the text, and if you know some of the quarto version of this play, it's very unpunctuated, and the punctuation does turn up in places that you would not expect in a modern production. Now Giles made the decision that he wanted the quarto punctuation to be in the play, and he wanted it on my side as well as on the right hand side as well as the left. He wanted the two punctuation marks to correspond. His decision, I have no power to change that at all. There were many places where I felt it was misleading to use the original quarto punctuation. I would point them out to him and he'd say, oh, okay, in this particular case, let's maybe, But his point was that the actors coming to this text presented with he's not as purist as some directors who will say, let's stick to the folio at all costs and not change it at all, but he is a bit of a purist. And so when I say to him, but the actors will find this line difficult, he'd say, that's great. I mean, let them find the meaning, let's challenge the actors. I said, Giles, they're already being challenged with the fleeting pronunciation on the other side. But that's his choice. And it was the same last year. A different set of decisions were made by Tim Carroll. But in all cases, the punctuation reflects the addition that was used or the director's variation on the addition. And I just had to work with it. It's another compromise you have to make. I mean, you're only the linguist advisor. That's all you are. It's not your play, it's their play. The play is the thing. It's got to work as a play. And at the end of the day, of course, the supreme irony is this. If somebody leaves a performance of this play and says, the original pronunciation was fantastic, it was a terrible production, but I loved the original pronunciation, then I think we've all failed. There's nothing worse than a review of a play which says, the costumes are wonderful. And if you're an actor, you know, I mean, oh, that is a downer for any play. Well, you know, yeah, I want them to get the original pronunciation, but in a sense, I don't want anybody to notice that it's there, really, at the end of the day. If people go to this play because they want to hear, as some buffs will, you know, go for phoneticians in the audience, or something like that. All right, but there are exceptions. I want people to enjoy this Troilus play because the original pronunciation illuminates aspects that they didn't know were there. And I'll just end perhaps with one example, because it's a beauty from Troilus. The name of the character, Ajax. Ajax, big character in the play. At one point, Hector says of Ajax, for whomsoever he be, he is Ajax. And you think, what does that mean? For whomsoever, he's being insulting. For whomsoever he be, he is Ajax. Well, that seems like stating the obvious. And in modern English, the line has very little point. Now, when you realise that the Elizabethan pronunciation of Ajax was Ajax, the stress there, Ajax, usually, then something happens. Because, you see, the Elizabethan word for a piss house was jakes, a toilet, yeah? A mouldy toilet, jakes. As it is in modern Irish, you know, I'm going to the jakes. I'm going to the jakes, they say over there. And so his name is Ajax. So when the guy says, for whomsoever he be, he is Ajax, he says, whoever he thinks he is, he's just no more than a piss house. I mean, that's what's being said. And that is a great joke, which the groundlings would have loved. It's a lovely, risque joke. This is great, which of course is never got in modern English. Now, whether the modern audience will pick it up, I've no idea. All the Irish in the audience will, without a shadow of a doubt. But whether anybody else will, I don't know. But this is the joy of doing this kind of thing. Not because the pronunciation is an end in itself, but because the pronunciation can lead you into meanings which otherwise might be missed. And that, of course, is the hope, that people go away thinking, that sounded fresh, that sounded different, I've learned something, I noticed jokes, puns and so on, that I didn't notice before. And that, of course, makes it all worthwhile. Well, thank you very much.